Let me begin with an archbishop. Not the present one, but William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1940s. And at one stage he said this: "My ignorance of science is so profound as to be distinguished," unquote. And it's one of the few things I know in which I'm on a level with an archbishop, because my knowledge or my ignorance of science is at that level. I guess when I was at school, I would have got about 20 or 30% in the subject of science, and I'm not sure that today I would get very much beyond that. I'm fascinated by the subject, however, but I'm not frightened by it. And my sense is that there are many people, many Christians, we're in a Christian church here, so I go in as strongly as that. I believe there are many Christians who are somewhat intimidated by the word science, so that when they read in a newspaper, here on the radio or television, scientists have shown, or science has said, or this scientist has discovered, they mentally at least back off a little and say, well, I wasn't sure that things were exactly like that. I'm not sure where that squares with Christian teaching, for example. But if science has made that discovery, if a scientist says something, I guess it must be true. Well, let me begin by saying this, that no statement made by a scientist is necessarily a scientific statement. There's a difference between a statement made by a science and a scientific statement. All the man is giving you is what he believes at that point. And so it would be useful, before we went any further, to define, for our purposes tonight, what science is. Now, in medieval times, the word science was a synonym for knowledge, so that the science of geography or the science of biology or the science of medicine simply meant the knowledge that we have of those particular subjects. That, however, is no longer the case. An American scholar, J.P. Moreland, says this, quote, "No generally accepted definition of what science is agreed on by a majority of philosophers of science," unquote. Well, if that's what the scholars say, it makes things pretty daunting, it seems to me. So let me try to give you what I hope will serve as a working definition of science. Science is the ongoing process of discovering truth in the natural world. Now, if you were a classroom of 10 or 12-year-olds, I might just say to you, please say after me, but I wouldn't insult you like that, so I'll just repeat it for myself. Science is an ongoing process of discovering truth in the natural world. And I'm sure we'll come back to that later on. But sufficient to say at this point that it is a process. It is not a finished product. This lectern is a finished product. This platform is a finished product. But science is not a product. Science hasn't to be seen in that light at all, mustn't be seen in that light at all. It's not an end, it's a means to an end. In true science, the latest word is not the last word. There was a lovely cartoon in the New Scientist some years ago. The setting is a classroom, and a student has obviously asked the lecturer a question to which he has given an answer, and now the student takes up the discussion and the cartoon kicks in. And she says to the lecturer, "Are you sure that that's the answer to the question?" "Oh yes, that is the correct answer to the question. But sir, I asked you the same question yesterday and you gave me a completely different answer." And he said, "Yes, Jennifer, but you must realize science is making tremendous strides." Sir Karl Popper, arguably the world's best-known philosopher of science, says this: "Every scientific statement must remain tentative forever." Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, said this: "Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty. Some unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain," unquote. Now that's pretty remarkable. Let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. Some years ago, cutting-edge science would tell us that the planets and other heavenly bodies are held in space by something called ether. Now, if you were to say to a physicist today, an astrophysicist in particular, that's what holds the planets in space, it's something called ether, they would laugh you out of court. I recall after reading about a discovery made by the Hubble Space Telescope, a leading scientist said this: we will have to rewrite the laws of physics. Well, of course, he didn't mean that we'd have to rewrite the laws of physics. What he was saying was, what we said were the laws of physics, we just have to tweak the wording a bit because we have now made another discovery which puts a different slant on what we've previously told you. All of this tells us that true science has limitations. But that's not what atheists would tell us. Now, of course, not all scientists are atheists, and we'll come on to that later. But atheists who are scientists would tell us something very different. Here's Peter Atkins, who lectures in physical chemistry at Oxford University, and in a debate in 1998, he said this, quote, "I am on the brink of discovering everything." I just interrupt to say that his 6-volume work on humility and how I easily accomplished it will be published very soon. But I am on the brink of discovering everything, and I commend you to use your brains. Because your brains are the most wonderful instruments in the universe. And through your brains, you will see that you can do without God. There is no necessity for God because science can explain everything. Unquote. And Bertrand Russell, a philosopher of a previous generation, said this, quote, "What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Unquote. In other words, only science can tell us the real truth about anything. Now, that's exciting stuff. It really is exciting stuff. I think science can tell us the truth about anything to which it sets its mind eventually. Except that that's not science. Instead, it's something called scientism. Or to give it another word, it's reductionism. Or to give it, I think, an even better word by the Scotsman Donald Mackay, it is nothing buttery. I think that's a great phrase for it. In other words, it says that all reality is nothing but atoms and molecules. True even of the most amazing objects we have on the face of this planet, which are human beings. We are nothing but atoms and molecules. Get it? Nothing buttery, reductionism. The word is scientism. Here, for example, is something that Richard Dawkins says. For those of you who've never heard of Richard Dawkins, welcome back from planet Zog. But let me just tell you who he is, and I quote, because I don't want to get this wrong. He is the world's best known and most respected atheist, unquote. And I have that on very good authority. That was said by Richard Dawkins. So we know who we're talking about. And Richard Dawkins said this, quote, "Truth means scientific truth," unquote. I mean, it is so easy to dismantle that statement. Firstly, it's not a scientific statement. So on its own terms, it can't be true. It's just an empty soundbite. Truth means scientific truth. Secondly, a scientific description of something is not the only valid description. If I came to your home and said to you, would you please infuse some Camellia sinensis leaves in a liquid compound of oxygen and hydrogen, you'd probably say, you've been out in the sun too long. But if I were to say, would you kindly make me a cup of tea, you would understand exactly what I meant. But I would be saying exactly the same thing. Firstly, I'd be saying it in scientific terms, and then I'd be saying it in more domestic and normal terms. Imagine that you're out watching a lovely sunset, and you tell somebody about it in the most lyrical, poetic, even romantic terms. That would be a wonderful description of it, and we could all get exactly what you were saying. Now, you have a scientist alongside you watching the same sunset, and he could probably give you 10 minutes of involved scientific formulae as to exactly what you were seeing. His description of it would be valid, but it would not be the only valid description. Imagine a husband coming home after being away for a week, and he says to his wife, let's juxtapose our orbicular muscles and have a reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes. She would say, where in the world did you learn that kind of language? and he'd say, darling, I just want to kiss you. He'd be saying exactly the same thing in two different ways. His way of saying it, and I've never come across it being said actually, nothing I ever used, is precisely the same as, I'd like to kiss you. It's just the scientific way of saying it. It's not the only way of saying it. And thirdly, many things are beyond the reach of science and the scientific method of observation and experiment. So let me give you some examples. And hear me carefully. There are many things, many valid, important things in our lives that are utterly beyond the reach of science and the scientific method. And here are some. Firstly, science can't tell us why the world came into being. Notice my language. It cannot tell us why the world came into being. You know that the modern thinking centers around the Big Bang, which is said to have occurred 15 billion years ago. But to have a Big Bang, we would need something that went bang. And what science cannot tell us is, well, why was there something instead of nothing? Not merely why did it go bang, but why was there something there in the first place? There has to be, at the very least, there has to be matter and energy. And we can validly ask science, please tell us how the matter and the energy got there. And science can't tell us that. In Black Holes and Baby Universes, the British physicist Stephen Hawking says this, quote, although science may solve the problem of how the universe began, it cannot answer the question, quote, why does the universe bother to exist, unquote. I don't know the answer to that. Secondly, science can't explain why there are natural laws and why they are so consistent and dependable. For example, the law of gravity says that a free-falling object accelerates at the rate of 981 centimeters per second. When I was at school, it used to be 32 feet per second, which shows you how long ago that I was at school. It's, of course, exactly the same thing. What science can tell us is, well, why is there a law of gravity, and why is it that number? Did a committee decide it? Did a focus group decide it? If Scotland goes independent, will it be able to change it? Let's not go down that route. But science cannot explain why they're there. Thirdly, science can tell us that the human body has 80,000 miles of blood vessels. But it can't explain why we are persons and not just machines for processing blood. Science can tell us that the human brain has 100 billion neurons, which is the same number of trees that exist in 2.7 million square miles of Amazonian rainforest. And each one of those neurons has up to 100,000 connections with other parts of the human brain. Now, science can tell us that, and I'm not about to argue with it. I will accept it. But it can't tell us why the mind exists and why it functions the way it does. Here is the Oxford biochemist Arthur Peacock. There is something about the mind, and therefore about who you really are, that science cannot get at. And fifthly, science can't explain ethical principles. In 1945, the famous British geneticist and atheist, J.B.S. Haldane, said this, science can't give an answer to the question, why should I be good, unquote. I would have thought that's a pretty important question in today's world, or in yesterday's world, and it will be in tomorrow's world. Why should I be good? That's a question, after all, that children sometimes ask their parents. Why can't I do that? Why must I do that? And the parent would say, because it's the right thing to do. And the child asks, well, why is there such a thing as a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do? And why should I be good? Now, it's no good turning to science, because science can't answer the question. John Lennox, the mathematician from Oxford, loves to say it, to put it in these terms, science can tell you that if you add strychnine to somebody's drink, you will kill them. But science can't tell you whether it's morally right or wrong to put strychnine in your grandmother's tea so that you can lay your hands on her property. I would have thought it's pretty important to know whether that's right or wrong, and a court of law might want to have a say in it. Sixthly, science cannot answer life's biggest questions. Here is Steve Jones, who lectures in genetics at London University, passionate atheist. Quote, "Science cannot answer the questions that philosophers or children ask. Why are we here? What's the point of being alive? How ought we to behave?" So to recap, the statement, truth means scientific truth, is illogical nonsense. Secondly, scientific knowledge is not the only form of knowledge. And thirdly, scientific knowledge can take us so far, but no further. That being the case, there must be reality beyond the reach of science. If science can only take us so far, but reality exists that we know goes beyond that, then there must be a way of exploring and knowing about that. Now, that's not what we usually get from the media, which is so heavily slanted in favor of atheistic or agnostic thinking. Here is Richard Dawkins on BBC Television's program Soul of Britain. "I think science really has fulfilled the need that religion did in the past of explaining things. Explaining why we are here, what is the origin of life, where did the world come from, what life is all about. Science has the answers," unquote. That's an extraordinary lot of nonsense to put into one sentence. Let me just go back over that. Science has fulfilled the need of explaining why we are here. Well, it doesn't. What's the origin of life? Well, it doesn't. Where did the world come from? Well, it doesn't. What is life all about? Well, it doesn't. And it doesn't do any of those things because its reach isn't long enough. Imagine that you were crossing the Atlantic by a liner and you couldn't sleep one night, so you got up on deck with the torch in your hand and you thought, "I'll just wander around and just see what's going on." And then you look over the rail and you think, "I wonder what the bottom of the Atlantic looks like." So you switch on your torch, shine it down, and of course you can't see the bottom of the Atlantic. Does that mean that it's not there? No. Then why can't you see it? You're doing your best, you're pointing the torch in the right direction. The reason you can't see it is the reach of the torch isn't long enough. It doesn't reach far enough. And that's really the major point that I'm making here, is that science and its offspring technology, we are so hugely indebted to them. Nevertheless, there are issues it simply cannot reach. So that takes us back to our question, has science got rid of God? I'm often told, well, of course, science deals with facts, but religion is just a matter of faith. As if there's this great dichotomy between the two. Well, there isn't. I would go further and say that science is impossible without faith, because all true scientists are believers. They believe in certain things and they act on the basis that those things are true. To give the two, let me give you three obvious answers. The first is, scientists believe that we live in a universe that can be examined and studied and understood and trusted. Albert Einstein once said, "The most incomprehensible fact of nature is that it's comprehensible." That's a great statement. The most, let me substitute for the word incomprehensible, I guess he is saying amazing. Do you know the most amazing thing about the universe is that we can understand it. The more we study, the more we discover about it, and the more we understand just what it is that makes it work, that it works according to fixed laws. And science would be impossible if that were not the case. If scientists did not believe of the universe, in the universality and dependency, for example, of the laws of gravity and motion, science would be impossible. Secondly, scientists believe, this is my point, they're men and women of faith, they believe that the human mind can process the information they discover and come to sensible conclusions about it. They trust their eyes and their ears, and they trust that they're telling them the truth and that they are in some way in tune with the natural world. Here's Einstein again about accepting the laws governing the universe. He says that they can be understood because they belong, quote, to the sphere of religion, unquote. In other words, there is a powerful, underlying, irresistible, irreplaceable dimension of faith to it all. And thirdly, scientists believe that logic is dependable. They believe that logic is dependable, and without logic, science would be sunk without trace. But there's no scientific way of proving that logic is dependable. They just do it because they are believers. So let's be clear before we go any further. Science is primarily based on faith. In a lecture given to the Royal Institution in London, the British physicist William Henry Bragg, and perhaps uniquely, but by all means correct me afterwards if I'm wrong, it's not a hugely important point, but he and his son William Lawrence Bragg were joint Nobel Prize winners for their work in X-ray crystallography. Now, there may be other joint Nobel laureates, father and son together, but they certainly were in 1915. And addressing the Royal Institution, he said this: sometimes people ask if religion and science are opposed to each other. And he went on, they are, in the sense that the fingers and thumb of my hand are opposed to each other. It is an opposition by which anything can be grasped. Now that's brilliant. He said, if all we use is science, we don't get the complete answer. If all we use is religion, we don't get the complete answer. Use them both together in the opposition of which he was speaking, and it's a means by which we can grasp things. The fact of the matter is, however, in the world in which we live today, many people would sooner trust technology than they would theology. I love the story of the long-distance international flight, and halfway through the flight, the captain came onto the tannoy and said, ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking, and I think it fair to tell you that we've lost power in one of our engines. In fact, we've had to shut it down completely. And in case that makes you nervous, I want to assure you that this plane is so built that the 3 engines can take us safely to where we're going, and there's absolutely no need to be concerned. However, if you are still nervous, I have some good news for you. We have 4 bishops on board tonight, so we're all perfectly safe. One of the passengers got a message back to the pilot and saying, would you please tell the captain that it's all the same to him? I would be happier if we had 4 engines and only 3 bishops. So let me tighten the question. Has science got rid of God? And I'm not talking about the myriad gods that people have invented. I'm talking about the God of this book, the God of the Bible. Unique, transcendent, the creator of all reality outside of himself, and the sovereign of the universe to whom we must all give account. Has science got rid of this God? Well, back to Peter Atkins, lecturing there in Oxford, quote, religion is outmoded and ridiculous. It is not possible to believe in God and to be a true scientist, unquote. I better repeat that because of what's going to follow in the next 2 or 3 minutes. It is not possible to believe in God and to be a true scientist, unquote. Well, so much for the rhetoric. What about the reality? The reality is that every scientist in the world today, from the veriest atheist to the agnostics and the skeptics and the theists, yes, and the Christians, every scientist in the world today is standing on the shoulders of some of the greatest scientists the world has ever known, who believed that the universe was God's work and that the Bible is God's book. Let me give you some examples very quickly. Francis Bacon, who eventually became the Lord Chancellor, first put forward the new theory of scientific knowledge that became known as the inductive method, or the scientific method. The Irish physicist and chemist Robert Boyle is commonly recognized as the father of modern chemistry, unquote. He was a lay preacher. Atkins lectures in physical chemistry. Has he never heard of Robert Boyle? Or does he have selective amnesia? the British chemist and physicist Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction. The British physicist James Joule gave his name to Joule's law, which is used for calculating heat produced by an electric current moving through a wire. Every scientist in the world accepts that today. The German astronomer Johannes Kepler, acknowledged as the father of modern astronomy, wanted to be a Christian preacher. He frequently quoted the Bible in his work and said he was only thinking God's thoughts after him. The British scientist James Clerk Maxwell, who's been called the father of modern physics, first predicted the existence of radio waves. The English mathematician and physicist Sir Isaac Newton, universally recognized as one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. And you'll like this, on this side of Hadrian's Wall, the Scottish physicist William Thomson, the first Baron Kelvin, held the chair of philosophy at Glasgow University for 53 years, received 21 doctorates, and established the Kelvin scale of absolute temperatures, which every scientist in the world accepts today. Oh, but Peter Atkins says, you can't be a real scientist and believe in God. So all of these, or none of these, were clearly, in his view, real scientists. When the Royal Society, the first major scientific organization in history, came into being in 1662, its founders dedicated their work, and I quote, to the glory of God, unquote. One assumes from Peter Atkins that none of them was actually a true scientist. Today, the Human Genome Project, the most astonishing achievement of its kind in human history, has as its American director a man called Francis Collins, with whom I corresponded in the course of some of my writing. He describes himself as once having been, and I use his words, an obnoxious atheist, later became a committed Christian, largely through the reading the works of C.S. Lewis. And Francis Collins says this, the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. He can be worshipped in the cathedral and in the laboratory, unquote. I had a call preaching in a church in England not so very long ago, 300 people in the congregation. Over 30 of them were scientists who held earned doctorates in disciplines ranging from microbiology to medicine and from pharmacy to physics. But Peter Atkins says, but you can't be a true scientist and believe in God. True science, as opposed to scientism, reductionism, nothing buttery, true science points us beyond its limits. And I suggest to you it points to the idea that God does exist. And let me give you two examples. And in a couple of minutes' time, we'll have a chance for those comments and questions and answers that Dominic Smart mentioned a little while ago. But here are the two examples. One is massive, and the other is minute. The massive one is in the world of cosmology. 300 years ago, we had a very limited idea as to the size of the universe. Today, we know that our planet orbits around the sun, which is 1 million times its size. And we know that that's going on in what Stephen Hawking, I think, delightfully calls the outer suburbs of an ordinary spiral galaxy, which happens to be the Milky Way, which measures 621,000 million miles across, contains 100,000 million stars, and is one of 100,000 million galaxies in the known universe. And science can't explain to us how all that stuff got there and how it works together to make life possible on this planet. In a brief history of time, Stephen Hawking was searching for what he called a theory of everything, TOE. And some of you may remember he ends the argument like this. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. So I suggest to you that cosmology points us toward the existence of God and not away from it. And the second is minute in the world of biology. 150 years ago, Charles Darwin thought that a living cell was just a little blob of matter. Well, today we know differently. We know that the tiniest bacterial cell is made up of 100,000 million atoms and is more complicated than any piece of machinery ever built by man. Now, I find that astonishing. I'm told today that the technology in a mobile phone is more complicated than the technology that powered the first lunar landing. And yet, one tiny bacterial cell contains more complicated information than the most complicated piece of machinery ever built by man. There is more information in the DNA of a single human cell than in the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. Now imagine that this is how the Encyclopedia Britannica came to us. Somebody was walking along out on an open moor somewhere, and they saw something fall from the sky and land in front of them. They picked it up, and eventually it was discovered that what we had here was, in effect, the amount of information we have in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Everybody in the world who engaged with the issue would recognize there must be superior intelligence out there. Where it is, what it is, we don't know, but it has to be so, because here we have this staggering amount of information, and it's just fallen out of the sky. Nobody would deny that intelligence must have an intelligent source. So when we know that there is more information in the DNA of a single human cell than in all of the Encyclopedia Britannica, we have to ask the question, well, where did that come from? If we didn't create it, we didn't make it, we didn't build it up, where did it come from? I suggest to you, that's a very gentle suggestion, I think it could be put much more strongly than this, I suggest to you that it points toward a superior intelligence, a transcendent intelligence. Now, I love the word transcendent. It's one of my very favorite English words. In fact, it's a toss-up between that and crème brûlée, except that that's two words in French, so I guess transcendent is going to win. Surely it would have to be conceded that that amount of intelligence must come from a transcendently intelligent source. And I put it to you that points toward the existence of the God of the Bible, who is said to possess all wisdom and knowledge.